Ainsley was having what could generously be called a monumentally terrible day. And that was before she stumbled into three apex predator cubs who were, apparently, having an even worse one. The climate control unit in the ambassadorial wing of the Concordance had decided, in its infinite mechanical wisdom, to malfunction at precisely the worst possible moment. Which, let's be honest, is exactly when all important things decide to break. Never during a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Always during high-stakes diplomatic negotiations when tempers are already running hot. And the last thing anyone needs is the actual temperature running hotter. Ainsley knelt in front of the access panel, her toolbox spread around her like a mechanical graveyard, and glared at the tangle of wires that seemed to have developed their own malicious consciousness. She was a maintenance technician, not a miracle worker, despite what the work orders seemed to imply. "Right," she muttered, yanking off her work boots because the ship's floors were absolutely freezing, and her feet had gone numb about 20 minutes ago. "Let's see what fresh nonsense you've cooked up today." Her fuzzy purple socks, thick, gloriously soft, and completely against uniform regulations, emerged like small acts of rebellion. They were her favorite pair, the ones she'd bought at a station market 3 months ago from a vendor who'd promised they were made from genuine Altarian cloud sheep wool. Probably a lie, but they were warm and ridiculous, and made her smile on days when nothing else did. Which was most days lately. The Concordance was a diplomatic vessel, which meant it was essentially a flying hotel for species who mostly couldn't stand each other but were trying very hard to pretend otherwise. Ainsley's job was to keep all the systems running smoothly, so that nobody had an excuse to start an interstellar incident over a broken shower or a flickering light panel. She'd been doing this for 3 years, 3 long, occasionally bizarre, frequently exhausting years. The wire in her hand sparked, and she yelped, dropping it. "Oh, fantastic! Love that for me! Really adds to the ambiance of this already delightful—" A sound cut through her grumbling. A sound that made every hair on her arms stand at attention. Every survival instinct she possessed suddenly scream in unison. A low, chittering growl, followed by a whimper. Then what could only be described as a hiss-purr-whine combination that belonged to nothing she ever wanted to meet in a dark corridor, which, naturally, is exactly where she was. A dark corridor. Alone, with her boots off. Ainsley froze, her hand still hovering near the sparking wire, and slowly, very, very slowly, turned her head toward the source of the sound. 3 pairs of luminescent golden eyes stared back at her from the shadows. Oh no. Oh no, 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 no. She knew those eyes. Everyone on the ship knew those eyes. They belonged to the Morith, the apex predators of the outer spiral, the species that had exactly 0 natural enemies because everything else had the good sense to evolve in a different star system entirely. The Morith were bipedal, scaled, and built like someone had taken a panther, given it opposable thumbs, and then asked it to bulk up at the gym for about a decade. They had retractable claws that could shred reinforced steel, multiple rows of serrated teeth designed for things Ainsley preferred not to think about, and a cultural identity centered almost entirely around being the galaxy's most efficient hunters. And there were 3 of them, small ones, cubs, staring at her, in the corridor, alone. Ainsley's brain, which had been having a rough time with the climate control unit, now simply gave up entirely and started playing a highlight reel of her life. It was disappointingly short and mostly involved fixing broken things while drinking terrible coffee. The largest of the 3 cubs, maybe waist height on Ainsley, which was still terrifyingly substantial, took a tentative step forward. The corridor's emergency lighting caught the iridescent sheen of her scales, deep violet fading to silver at the edges. Her ears, which were probably meant to be flat against her skull in hunting mode, were instead swiveling nervously in every direction. Ainsley said, which was definitely not the most eloquent thing she'd ever uttered, but given the circumstances, she'd give herself a pass. Hello? The cub froze. Then, in a movement so fast Ainsley's eyes could barely track it, she darted behind her siblings. Wait! The predator cub was hiding? The middle cub, slightly smaller with deep crimson scales and a patch of silver along his snout, made a sound that was equal parts whine and growl. His tail, thick and powerful, designed for balance during high-speed chases, was tucked against his legs. The smallest one, barely knee-height, with bright amber scales and oversized ears that kept twitching, stared at Ainsley with an expression that could only be described as absolutely terrified. And suddenly, Ainsley's brain rebooted and delivered a single, crystal-clear thought. These cubs were lost. Oh, she breathed, her fear evaporating and being instantly replaced by something far more dangerous, her instinct to help things that were clearly in distress. Oh, you poor things. Where are your parents? The largest cub, the violet one, peeked out from behind her siblings and made a soft chirping sound. Her claws, each one longer than Ainsley's fingers, kneaded anxiously against the floor plating. Ainsley glanced down the corridor. Empty. She reached for her comm unit, intending to contact security, and nothing. Dead air. Static. Right. Because she'd disabled the comm system in this section to work on the climate control without getting 1,000 status update requests. The panels were all interconnected in this wing, because whoever designed this ship clearly hated maintenance personnel on a personal level. Okay, Ainsley said slowly, talking more to herself than to the cubs. Okay, this is fine. This is totally fine. I'm just in a disabled corridor section with 3 baby apex predators and no way to call for help. Absolutely fine. Living my best life. The smallest cub, the amber one, took a wobbly step forward. Her golden eyes were huge, pupils dilated wide in the dim light. Hey, hey! Ainsley held up her hands, palms out, trying to look as non-threatening as a human possibly could, which, compared to Morith, was pretty non-threatening already. Humans were basically ambush predators who'd gotten really good at endurance hunting and tool use. Put them next to a species that could bite through starship hulls, and they were decidedly lower on the danger scale. It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you. The amber cub tilted her head, processing. Then she did something that nearly stopped Ainsley's heart. She rushed forward and latched onto Ainsley's leg with all 4 limbs, her claws carefully, miraculously, retracted. The weight was substantial. The warmth radiating through her scales was intense. The small rumbling sound she made was somewhere between a purr and a motorcycle engine. Oh my, Ainsley whispered, absolutely frozen. Oh my, okay, we're doing this now. The other 2 cubs, seeing their siblings' boldness, immediately followed suit. Within seconds, Ainsley had 3 Morith predator cubs clinging to her like she was a particularly interesting climbing structure, all of them making distressed noises that sounded like a percussion section warming up for a concert. Right, Ainsley said to the empty corridor, because there was nothing else to do. Guess I'm a babysitter now. Sure, why not? Add it to the resume. The violet cub, clearly the oldest and most cautious, pulled back slightly and looked up at Ainsley with those enormous golden eyes. She made a questioning trill, her head tilted at an angle that was almost comically inquisitive. Your parents are probably in the council chambers, Ainsley explained. even though she had no idea if the cub understood her. The emergency session about what was it? The territorial dispute in the median belt? They're probably worried sick about you. The crimson cub, the male, perked up at something in her tone and chattered back at her in what was definitely the Morith language. It sounded like rocks being tumbled in a dryer mixed with wind chimes. "I don't speak Morith, buddy," Ainsley said apologetically. "I barely speak Galactic Common on a good day, and today is decidedly not a good day." The smallest cub, still attached to her leg, looked up and made the most pathetic sound Ainsley had ever heard. It was the universal language of "I'm small and scared and I want my parent" that transcended species barriers. Something in Ainsley's chest cracked open. "Okay," she said softly, reaching down to gently pat the amber cub's head. The scales were warm and surprisingly smooth, like river stones in sunlight. "Okay, it's all right. We'll figure this out. Your parents are just in a meeting. They'll be done soon. Probably. Hopefully. I'm sure they're absolutely panicking, and there's going to be a ship-wide alert any minute now, and—" She waited. No alert. No emergency klaxons. No announcements. Which meant either the Morith ambassador hadn't noticed his cubs were missing yet, unlikely but possible if the negotiations were heated enough, or the security team was handling it quietly to avoid causing an interstellar incident. Either way, Ainsley was stuck with 3 terrified predator cubs in a disabled corridor section until someone figured out where they'd gone. "All right, little ones," she said, gently trying to detach them from her person with limited success. "Let's get you somewhere more comfortable while we wait for whatever happens next." She managed to shuffle back to her workspace, the cubs still partially attached to her, and lowered herself to sit on the floor with her back against the wall. Her purple fuzzy socks stretched out in front of her, a ridiculous pop of color against the gray deck plating. The cubs immediately rearranged themselves into a pile in her lap, which was both adorable and slightly terrifying given that each one probably weighed as much as a medium-sized dog and had the equipment to disembowel her if they felt so inclined. But they didn't feel so inclined. They felt inclined to huddle against her warmth, making soft, distressed noises, clearly missing their parent, and utterly overwhelmed by whatever circumstances had led them to escape their quarters. "What am I going to do with you 3? Ainsley murmured, looking down at the pile of scales and claws and enormous, vulnerable eyes. The violet cub looked up at her and chirped. The crimson one yawned, displaying an impressive array of very sharp teeth. The amber one nestled closer, her tail wrapping around Ainsley's arm. And Ainsley, whose day had started with a broken climate control unit and had somehow evolved into accidental xeno-babysitting, sighed deeply and accepted her fate. At least they were cute, in a could absolutely kill me but currently choosing not to kind of way, which, honestly, was pretty much how she'd describe most of her job on the Concordance. Just another day in diplomatic maintenance. Absolutely normal. Nothing to worry about. The crimson cub sneezed, a small puff of smoke emerging from his nostrils, and Ainsley revised her assessment. Maybe slightly more to worry about than usual. 15 minutes into her unexpected role as xeno-babysitter, Ainsley was beginning to understand why the galaxy's most feared predators had a reputation for being, well, feared. It wasn't the claws, it wasn't the teeth, it wasn't even the occasional puff of smoke sneeze from the crimson one. It was the energy. These cubs had energy that could probably power a small space station. Nervous, confused, scared energy that manifested in constant movement, constant noise, and a constant need to investigate absolutely everything within a 20-meter radius. No, don't eat that! Ainsley lunged forward, pulling a power coupling out of the amber cub's mouth. That's not food. That's very much not food. That's expensive equipment that I'll have to explain in a report if it goes missing." The amber cub looked offended, her ears flattening against her skull. I know. I'm a terrible temporary guardian," Ainsley muttered. "But trust me, your digestive system will thank me later." The violet cub, the cautious one, had discovered Ainsley's toolbox and was methodically removing each tool, examining it with intense focus, and then setting it down in a neat line. It was almost endearing. Almost. If Ainsley didn't need those tools and wasn't watching a creature with razor-sharp claws handle her expensive sonic wrench like a toy. The crimson cub, meanwhile, had found the access panel and was making a game of sticking his head inside, pulling it out, and then doing it again. And again. And again. "You're going to give yourself a concussion," Ainsley said, though she wasn't entirely sure Morith anatomy worked that way. For all she knew, their skulls were reinforced titanium. She'd tried entertaining them. She really had. She'd offered them her emergency ration bars, rejected after one sniff from the violet cub, who'd made a face that clearly communicated, "This is an insult to food everywhere." She'd attempted to show them a holographic puzzle game on her datapad. The crimson one had batted at the projections for about 30 seconds before losing interest. She'd even tried talking to them, telling them stories about her childhood on Earth. But the language barrier was pretty insurmountable when one party communicated primarily in chittering growls and the other in exasperated sighs. Ainsley slumped against the wall, her purple fuzzy socks stretched out in front of her, and seriously contemplated whether she could just curl up and take a nap. Maybe when she woke up, this would all have been a weird, stress-induced hallucination brought on by inhaling too many climate control fumes. The amber cub, who'd been investigating the far end of the corridor, suddenly went very still. Her ears perked up. Her tail stopped mid-swish. Her entire body locked into what Ainsley recognized as a hunting posture. Weight distributed perfectly, muscles coiled, every sense focused on a single point. The point being Ainsley's feet. "Oh, no," Ainsley said. "Whatever you're thinking, the answer is no." The cub's golden eyes fixed on the fuzzy purple socks, with an intensity that suggested she'd just discovered the secrets of the universe. She took one step forward, then another, moving with the fluid grace of a predator stalking prey. Except the prey was footwear. "They're just socks," Ainsley explained, though she was already pulling her feet back instinctively. Very normal, very boring socks. Nothing to get excited about. The amber cub pounced, not aggressively, not violently, but with the full commitment of a hunter securing a kill. She landed with her front paws on Ainsley's shin, her face pressed against the fuzzy purple fabric, and then she made a sound. It started as a low rumble, built into a stuttering purr, and emerged as something that could only be described as pure, unfiltered joy. Her eyes went half-closed, her ears relaxed. Her entire body seemed to melt against Ainsley's leg as she rubbed her scaled cheek against the soft fabric. "Oh," Ainsley breathed. "Oh, you like that?" The other two cubs, drawn by their siblings' obvious delight, abandoned their respective activities and rushed over to investigate. The violet cub reached out one careful claw and touched the sock. Her eyes widened. She made a questioning trill. The crimson cub simply grabbed Ainsley's other foot and pressed his whole face into it, purring so loudly that Ainsley could feel the vibration through her entire leg. And suddenly, Ainsley understood. Morith had scales, tough, armored, protective scales, and their paw pads, she could see them now, as the cubs shifted position, were thick and rough, designed for gripping and climbing and hunting across harsh terrain. They'd probably never felt anything soft in their entire lives. "You've never had fuzzy socks, have you?" Ainsley said, a smile tugging at her lips despite the absurdity of the situation. "This is a completely new texture for you." The amber cub looked up at her and chirped enthusiastically, still rubbing against the purple fabric like it was the best thing that had ever happened to her. An idea formed in Ainsley's mind, a terrible, ridiculous, absolutely unprofessional idea. But these cubs were scared and overwhelmed and clearly desperately in need of distraction, and she was fresh out of conventional solutions. "Okay," she said slowly. "Let me show you something." She gently extracted herself from the pile of fascinated predators, stood up, and looked down the long corridor. The floor was polished metal, smooth and slightly reflective. Perfect. Ainsley took 3 steps back, got a running start, and then jumped forward, landing with both feet together. She slid. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't dignified. But she slid a good 3 meters down the corridor in her fuzzy purple socks, arms windmilling for balance, before coming to a stop. The cubs stared at her in absolute silence. Then the amber one exploded into excited chattering, bouncing up and down like she'd just witnessed the most incredible feat in galactic history. "Yeah, it's pretty fun," Ainsley admitted, sliding back toward them. "Been doing it since I was a kid. Empty corridors, smooth floors, fuzzy socks. It's basically the law of the universe." The violet cub tilted her head, processing. Then she looked down at her own paws, completely devoid of fuzzy sock coverage, and made a disappointed sound. Ainsley's brain, which had clearly decided to fully commit to this insanity, went into problem-solving mode. Okay, hold on," she said, looking around her workspace. "I can work with this." Her equipment bag contained, among other things, several clean maintenance rags, soft, absorbent material used for wiping down sensitive equipment, and her emergency repair kit had elastic fasteners meant for bundling cables. 5 minutes later, Ainsley had created what could generously be called prototype sock booties for 3 extremely patient predator cubs. "All right," she said, sitting back to admire her handiwork. "I have no idea if this is going to work, but we're committed now." Each cub now had soft fabric wrapped around their back paws, the ones they'd use for pushing off, secured with elastic bands. It looked ridiculous. It looked like she'd dressed apex predators in improvised baby clothes. It was perfect. "Okay, Violet," Ainsley said, gesturing to the cautious cub. She needed names for them, even if they were just temporary identifiers. "You're Retha now. You," she pointed at the crimson male, "are Nask, and you," the amber bundle of chaos, "are Tiki. Everyone good with that?" They stared at her blankly. "Great. Unanimous approval. Now, Retha, you're the oldest. Want to try first?" Retha looked at her fabric-wrapped paws with deep suspicion. She took one experimental step, and the fabric shifted slightly. She froze, clearly wondering if this was a trap. "It's okay," Ainsley encouraged. "Just try a little push and—" Retha pushed off with her back legs, and immediately slid backward, completely unprepared for the loss of traction. Her eyes went huge with surprise as she glided a full meter in reverse before her front claws caught the deck plating and stopped her momentum. She sat down hard, looking utterly betrayed. Nask, the crimson male, chattered with what sounded suspiciously like laughter. Okay, not a great first attempt," Ainsley admitted, "but you've got the right idea, just wrong direction. Try facing forward this time." Retha stood up, shook herself with obvious dignity, and positioned herself carefully. This time, She pushed forward and slid. Not far, maybe a meter, but her expression transformed from suspicion to wonder in the space of a heartbeat. She made a sound that was pure delight. "There you go," Ainsley cheered. "You've got it!" Nask didn't wait for instruction. He launched himself down the corridor with absolutely no technique whatsoever, spinning sideways, overcorrecting, and crashing spectacularly into the far wall in a tangle of limbs and tail. He emerged from the collision looking absolutely thrilled, chattering excitedly. Tiki, the smallest, watched her siblings with intense focus. Then, with the fearless determination of the youngest child everywhere, she took a running start and jumped into a slide. She spun. She wobbled. She flailed. And then she found her balance, crouching low with her tail extended for stability, and glided smoothly down the corridor like she'd been doing it her whole life. When she came to a stop, she turned around and shrieked with joy. Ainsley couldn't help it. She laughed. A real, genuine laugh that echoed down the empty corridor and seemed to surprise the cubs as much as it surprised her. "All right, you tiny terrors," she said, her exhaustion temporarily forgotten in the face of their obvious happiness. "Let's see what you can really do." For the next 20 minutes, the disabled corridor section of the Concordance became an impromptu sliding arena. Retha approached it scientifically, testing different pushing techniques and studying the optimal angle for maximum distance. She was methodical, careful, and increasingly confident. Nask treated it like an extreme sport, attempting increasingly ridiculous maneuvers that ended in crashes about 60% of the time. He didn't seem to mind. If anything, the crashes made him more excited. Tiki was fearless chaos incarnate, sliding backward, sideways, and at one point attempting a move that looked suspiciously like a barrel roll. And Ainsley, despite every professional instinct screaming at her that this was absolutely not in her job description, found herself joining in. Because honestly, why not? She demonstrated proper technique. How to distribute your weight, how to use your arms for balance, how to control your speed. The cubs watched with rapt attention, mimicking her movements with surprising accuracy. A shadow passed by the corridor viewport, another crew member, probably, and Ainsley caught a glimpse of their face. Pure confusion mixed with concern, backing away slowly like they'd just witnessed something their brain couldn't process. "Yeah, that's about right," Ainsley muttered. Tiki crashed into her legs, purring loudly, and Ainsley reached down to steady the cub without thinking. The small amber predator looked up at her with absolute trust and happiness, her golden eyes bright. And Ainsley felt something shift in her chest, something warm and protective and completely unexpected. "All right," she said softly. "One more round, then we should probably figure out how to get you back to your parents before someone raises an actual alarm." The cubs responded with enthusiastic chattering. They lined up at one end of the corridor, Retha, Nask, Tiki, and Ainsley, all wearing their improvised sock booties. "On 3, Ainsley said. 1, 2, 3. They pushed off together, sliding down the polished corridor in a chaotic, joyful mass of scales and laughter and fuzzy purple socks. And for just a moment, Ainsley forgot about the broken climate control, the diplomatic tensions, the impossible complexity of keeping a ship like the Concordance running. For just a moment, it was just play. Simple, universal, joyful play, which naturally is exactly when everything got complicated again. The cubs had moved beyond simple sliding. Now they were innovating, which was either impressive or terrifying depending on how Ainsley chose to look at it. She was trying very hard to focus on impressive, while simultaneously keeping one eye on the structural integrity of her makeshift sock booties. "Okay, new game," Nask chattered, positioning himself at the far end of the corridor. He'd discovered that if he got a running start and then tucked into a ball mid-slide, he could spin like a scaled missile. It was objectively dangerous. It was also objectively hilarious. Retha had taken a different approach entirely. She'd figured out that by angling her body just right and using her tail as a rudder, she could navigate around the support struts that lined the corridor. She was turning sliding into an art form, each movement precise and calculated. And Tiki? Tiki had decided that the rules of physics were suggestions at best. "No, no, you can't slide up the wall," Ainsley called out, as the smallest cub attempted exactly that. "That's not how gravity works." Tiki managed it anyway, somehow using her momentum and claws to briefly defy several laws of nature before tumbling back down in a graceful roll. She landed on her feet, looking immensely proud of herself. "I don't even know how you did that," Ainsley admitted. The cubs were chattering among themselves now, a rapid-fire conversation in their rock-tumbler language that Ainsley couldn't follow but could definitely interpret through context and body language. They were planning something. "Why do I get the feeling I should be concerned?" Ainsley muttered. Retha turned to her and made a complex series of gestures, pointing at herself, then her siblings, then down the corridor, then at Ainsley. "You want to race? All of us?" Enthusiastic chirping confirmed her guess. "All right," Ainsley said, cracking her knuckles. "But I've got way more experience with sock sliding than you three. Don't get discouraged when I absolutely destroy you." Nask made a sound that was definitely a laugh. The little troublemaker. They lined up, Retha on the far left, methodical and focused. Nask next to her, already vibrating with barely contained energy. Tiki beside him, crouched low like a miniature apex predator. And Ainsley on the end, suddenly feeling like maybe she'd gotten herself into something ridiculous. Which was accurate, but still. "On 3, Ainsley said. 1, Nask bolted. "Hey, I said on 3, not on 1, you little cheat." But the other cubs had already launched after their brother, and Ainsley had no choice but to push off and join the chaos. The corridor became a blur of motion and laughter, and the soft whoosh slide of fabric against polished metal. Nask was in the lead through sheer reckless enthusiasm, spinning wildly and somehow maintaining forward momentum. Tiki was close behind, low to the ground and focused. Retha had taken a wider angle, clearly planning something strategic. And Ainsley? Ainsley had height and weight on her side, which translated to speed. She caught up to Tiki first, the little cub glancing up at her with wide golden eyes that clearly communicated, "Oh no, the tall one is fast." "Sorry, kiddo," Ainsley grinned. "Physics are on my side." She pulled ahead, drawing level with Nask just as he attempted another spin move. The Crimson Cub's eyes narrowed in determination, and he pushed harder, and clipped one of the support struts with his shoulder, sending him careening sideways into Ainsley. They collided in a tangle of limbs and scales and fuzzy socks, both of them sliding sideways now, completely out of control. Ainsley grabbed Nask instinctively, trying to protect him from the impact she knew was coming. Retha appeared out of nowhere, using her superior navigation skills to intercept their trajectory. She planted her front claws and became a living brake, catching both of them and absorbing their momentum. They all tumbled to a stop in a heap. For a moment, there was silence. Then Tiki slid past them in a blur of amber scales, chirping victoriously as she crossed the invisible finish line they'd established. Nask, trapped under Ainsley's arm, made an outraged sound. Retha's shoulders were shaking, and Ainsley realized with shock that the violet cub was laughing. Actually laughing, a rhythmic chittering sound that was surprisingly musical. Okay, okay, Tiki wins, Ainsley conceded, untangling herself from the pile. Fair and square, even if her brothers tried to take me out. Nask protested loudly, clearly arguing that the collision was accidental. Sure it was, Ainsley said, reaching out to ruffle the scales on his head. He leaned into the touch, still grumbling but obviously pleased. They ran the race 3 more times. Tiki won twice more through a combination of fearlessness and being low to the ground. Retha won once through superior strategy. Nask never won, but seemed to be having the most fun, which Ainsley decided was victory enough. As they lined up for what Ainsley had declared absolutely the final race, I mean it this time, she noticed something that made her pause. The cubs were working together now. Retha was showing Nask how to angle his approach around the struts. Tiki was demonstrating her low crouch technique to both siblings. They were teaching each other, learning from each run, adapting their strategies. And then it hit her. "Oh," Ainsley said softly. "Oh, you're not just playing." Retha looked up at her, tilting her head in question. "You're hunting," Ainsley continued, the realization settling over her. "This whole time, the slides, the spins, the navigation, you're practicing hunting movements, approach vectors, evasion techniques, pack coordination." The cubs stared at her with those luminous golden eyes. "That's why you picked it up so fast," Ainsley breathed. "It maps onto something instinctual. The slide is like a pounce. The turns are like cornering prey. The competition is pack-hunting practice." She sat back against the wall, looking at the 3 predator cubs with new understanding. They were lonely. That much was obvious from how desperately they'd latched onto her, how eager they'd been for any kind of interaction. But they were also young Maurith, with instincts bred into them over millions of years of evolution. They needed to play, but their play was fundamentally different from human play. Except, somehow, fuzzy sock sliding had bridged that gap, had given them something that was both joyful and purposeful, both fun and practice. "You 3 are pretty clever, aren't you?" Ainsley murmured. Tiki chirped and head-butted her knee affectionately. Nask was already trying to convince his sisters to run another race. And Retha sat beside Ainsley, close enough that her warmth radiated through her scales and made a soft rumbling sound that might have been contentment. Ainsley was just about to suggest they actually try to find their way back to the ambassadorial quarters when she heard it. Footsteps. Multiple sets. Heavy ones. And voices. "Last reported in this section, sir, but the surveillance is down for maintenance." "My cubs would not simply vanish. They are Maurith. Even as younglings, they are capable of—" The voices stopped abruptly. Ainsley looked up to find 2 figures standing at the corridor intersection, both frozen in apparent shock. Rowan, the first officer, was a tall human with close-cropped hair and an expression that usually suggested he was perpetually disappointed in the universe's life choices. Right now, that expression had evolved into something beyond disappointment, past confusion, and landed somewhere in the territory of "my brain has given up processing reality." Next to him stood a Maurith that could only be the cub's father. He was massive, easily 8 feet tall, with scales that ranged from deep violet to obsidian black, arranged in patterns that probably meant something significant in Maurith culture. His golden eyes were the same shade as his cubs, but larger, sharper, and currently locked onto the scene before him with an intensity that made Ainsley's survival instincts scream. The scene being 1 maintenance technician in fuzzy purple socks, 3 predator cubs in improvised sock booties, all of them caught mid-slide position in a corridor that definitely did not look like official shipboard activity. Ainsley said. I can explain. The silence stretched for approximately 3 heartbeats. Then all 3 cubs shrieked in unison and launched themselves at their father. Ainsley's brain, which had been preparing for approximately 19 different terrible outcomes, ranging from fired to become an interspecies incident, stuttered to a halt as she watched the enormous Morith ambassador get absolutely mobbed by his offspring. Thraxmole, because that had to be who this was, staggered back half a step under the combined weight of 3 cubs, all climbing him at once, chattering excitedly in their rock-tumbler language. His expression, which had been locked in what Ainsley assumed was either rage or shock, shifted into something she couldn't quite parse. Confusion, maybe, or concern. Tiki had claimed his right shoulder and was gesturing wildly with her paws, the sock booties still attached and flapping with each movement. Nask was wrapped around his midsection, purring loud enough that Ainsley could hear it from 5 meters away. Retha had taken a more dignified position at his feet, but her tail was lashing with obvious excitement. They were all talking at once, over each other, creating a cacophony of chittering and growling and trilling that somehow seemed to communicate an entire afternoon's worth of events in about 30 seconds. Thraxmole's eyes, those sharp, golden, predatory eyes, tracked from his cubs to Ainsley and back again. Ainsley stood up slowly, her fuzzy purple socks suddenly feeling incredibly inadequate as professional footwear. "Ambassador, I can—" Thraxmole made a low sound in his chest. Not a growl, exactly. More like a rumble that vibrated through the deck plating. The cubs immediately fell silent. He spoke to them in Morith, his voice like stones grinding together, but somehow gentle. It was a strange contrast, this massive apex predator speaking with obvious care to his offspring. Retha responded first, stepping forward and gesturing toward Ainsley with one careful claw. Her tone was different from the excited chattering, more formal, more deliberate. Thraxmole listened, turned his gaze to Ainsley, back to his daughter. Nask jumped in, unable to contain himself, spinning in a circle, and then demonstrating a slide move right there in front of his father. He made it about a meter before his sock booty caught, and he tumbled, popping back up instantly with an expression that clearly said, "Did you see that? It was amazing." Tiki was tugging on her father's arm, pulling him toward the corridor where they'd been playing, and Ainsley stood there, next to Rowan, who looked like he'd mentally left his body to avoid processing the situation. "So?" Rowan said quietly, his voice carefully neutral. "When I asked you to repair the climate control in the ambassadorial wing, this is not what I had in mind." "In my defense," Ainsley whispered back, "the cubs found me, and they were scared, and I couldn't exactly leave 3 terrified predator children alone in a disabled corridor section. The sock sliding seems like it might have been optional. They were upset. I was trying to distract them. With sock sliding. It worked, didn't it?" Rowan made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh or possibly an aneurysm. "I'm going to need you to file a report about this." "A report that says what, exactly?" "Engaged in unauthorized recreational activities with ambassadorial offspring while neglecting assigned maintenance duties?" "That's actually pretty accurate." Thraxmole turned back to them, and both Ainsley and Rowan fell immediately, silent. The ambassador approached slowly, his cubs trailing behind him like a small hunting party. Up close, he was even more imposing, all muscle and scale and barely contained power. His claws, retracted but visible, were each the length of Ainsley's hand. He stopped directly in front of her. Ainsley tilted her head back to maintain eye contact, her heart hammering against her ribs, and waited. Thraxmole studied her for a long moment, then his gaze dropped to her fuzzy purple socks, to the improvised sock booties still attached to his cub's paws, to the scattered maintenance equipment and the polished corridor that clearly showed the evidence of extensive sliding activity. When he spoke, his galactic common was heavily accented but perfectly clear. "You taught my cubs to slide?" "Yes, sir," Ainsley said. "I did. In my defense." "They are laughing." Ainsley blinked. "I'm sorry?" Thraxmole gestured to his offspring, who were indeed making happy, chittering sounds, their bodies relaxed and their tails swishing with contentment. "They are laughing," he repeated. "I have not heard them laugh like this in—" He paused, something crossing his expression that looked almost like pain. "In many months." "Oh," Ainsley said softly. The ambassador lowered himself into a crouch, bringing his eyes level with hers. It should have been more terrifying, all that predatory focus concentrated on her, but something in his posture read as non-threatening, almost vulnerable. "May I ask," he said carefully, "how you achieved this?" Ainsley glanced at the cubs, who were watching their father with obvious curiosity. "Honestly, I have no idea. They were scared. I was the only one here. They latched onto me, and I just tried to help. The sliding thing was an accident. They liked my socks." "Your socks? They're fuzzy. I don't think they'd ever felt anything soft before." Thraxmole looked down at his own paws, thick, scaled, built for killing. Then at his cub's paws, slightly smaller but already developing the same armored plating. "No," he said quietly. "They have not." Something in his tone made Ainsley's chest ache. "Ambassador," she ventured carefully, Are they all right? I mean, beyond the whole escaping from quarters thing?" Thraxmole was silent for a long moment. His cubs moved closer to him, sensing something in his stillness. "The Morith are warriors," he said finally. "We are raised to hunt, to fight, to dominate. Strength is everything. Weakness is—" He gestured vaguely. "Not tolerated." "That sounds exhausting," Ainsley said before she could stop herself. To her shock, Thraxmole made a sound that might have been agreement. "I am ambassador to the Galactic Council," he continued. "My time is spent in negotiations, in territorial disputes, in matters of war and peace. My cubs accompany me because Morith offspring stay with their parents until they reach hunting age. But the other species—" He paused. "Their young are frightened of my cubs. They see teeth and claws and run." Retha made a small, sad sound. "So my cubs are lonely," Thraxmole said, "and I do not know how to help them. In our culture, we train for combat. We practice hunting techniques. We build strength and skill. But this—" He gestured at the corridor, at the evidence of play. "This joy for the sake of joy. We have forgotten this, if we ever knew it at all." Ainsley felt something crack open in her understanding. These weren't just scared cubs who'd gotten lost. They were isolated children, desperately lonely, trapped in a culture that valued strength over happiness and had a father who could see their pain but didn't know how to fix it. "They weren't just playing," Ainsley said slowly. "The sliding, they turned it into hunting practice. The spins and turns and competitions. They were instinctively training themselves while having fun." Thraxmole's eyes sharpened. "Show me." What?" "Show me this sliding." He straightened to his full height, towering over her. "If my cubs can learn joy while building skill, then I must understand it. You want me to teach you to sock slide?" Yes. Ainsley looked at Rowan, who had backed up several steps and was watching the entire interaction with the expression of someone who'd accidentally stumbled into an alternate dimension. Sir, Rowan said weakly, I'm not sure this is— I am requesting cultural exchange, Thraxmul said, his voice taking on a formal tone. This human has demonstrated a technique that brings happiness to Morith offspring. As ambassador, I must evaluate its potential applications. You're pulling rank to learn sock sliding, Ainsley said. Yes. The cubs erupted into excited chattering, bouncing around their father's legs. And Ainsley, because her day had already crossed so far into surreal territory that there was no point in turning back now, sighed and held out a bundle of maintenance rags and elastic fasteners. All right, Ambassador, let's get you some sock booties. 20 minutes later, the corridor had witnessed something that would probably go down in Concordance history. An 8-foot-tall Morith ambassador, wearing improvised fabric booties on his back paws, attempting to slide down a polished corridor while his 3 cubs cheered him on, and a maintenance technician provided coaching. His first attempt was catastrophic. Thraxmul was built like a tank, all muscle and mass, and absolutely zero understanding of how to shift his weight for sliding. He pushed off with the force that probably would have launched a smaller creature into orbit, and instead of gliding, he basically stumbled forward 3 steps before his claws caught the deck plating and he stopped dead. The cubs thought this was hilarious. Thraxmul looked down at his feet with an expression of deep betrayal. You're overthinking it, Ainsley called out. Less power, more balance. Think of it like stalking prey. You want to be smooth, not aggressive.